talk. It was interesting. It was.
Yeah.
Are you going to be walking around?
Oh, no. I can just stand behind the podium, just like this.
Okay, because
so you
like,
can
if you have to walk anywhere, just like let us know. Like just I don't
Oh,
know.
is this the camera?
Yeah, because
Okay.
we're gonna have to like move the camera a little bit.
I have no plans, so I'll just stand still.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
1 minute, okay. Hello, my name is Nick. Full name is Nick Stevens. I'm going to be talking about a number of trust zone bugs in Huawei phones, also just normal Huawei kernel bugs. If you don't know what Huawei is, that's okay. I'm going to talk about it in just a second. I also want to briefly apologize for the program just has my bio as the description of this talk. I'm not just going to be talking about myself. I'm going to be talking about actual technical work, so I'm sorry if anyone's confused by that. I don't know how that happened. So the first little bit about me, I play on the Shellfish CTF team. If you're familiar with CTF, it stands for Capture the Flag. It's like a hacking competition, but more focused on actual exploit development and software vulnerability finding, less so about like pen testing. I also worked on the Cyber Grand Challenge, which is another thing that's similar to CTF, but it was run by DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Programs Agency or something. They ran a competition to see who could write an automated hacking tool, a tool that could find bugs automatically and automatically write exploits for the bugs it found. So it was sort of called the self-driving car equivalent of hacking. So I worked a lot on that with Shellfish as well. And then also we published a number of research papers on subjects like automated bug finding and automated exploitation. And also I published some papers on Android bugs and just trust zone bugs in general and the kind of problems that trust zone can introduce. And if you're not familiar with any of these things like trust zone, I'm going to be talking about them and introducing them to you. In general, just played a lot of CTF, and now I currently work for Raytheon CSI as a vulnerability researcher. You may have actually heard of us before. We used to go by a lot of different names, such as Raytheon SI Govs and Raytheon COI, and now it's CSI. You can just call it Raytheon. And I do this kind of work for a living that I'm about to present. If you're interested, please let me know. We're always hiring. So first of all, the goal of this talk is to demonstrate a way to completely compromise the Huawei P9. Now, the Huawei is a Chinese phone manufacturer. They're not very popular in the States, so if you haven't heard of them, don't worry. They actually have a very difficult time entering the U.S. market because of national security concerns. You can find them in the news about once a year. They often get in trouble. But besides making phones, what they also do is they'll make network equipment and sell that to other countries that the U.S. finds unsavory. Now, this is a pretty interesting target because they don't actually see as much public scrutiny. So I decided to look for bugs in it as an exercise. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from an untrusted app on your phone and completely compromise something called the TEE, which stands for the Trusted Execution Environment. Now, this is actually a special operating context on your phone that many people don't know about. It's pretty different than what most people are familiar with when it comes to security architectures between like Ring 0 and Ring 1, Ring 3, excuse me. But because of the number of sensitive operations that take place on our smartphones, ARM in particular and mobile manufacturers in general have introduced more security mitigations to stop roots from being able to completely steal all your information. So all your sensitive fingerprint data is actually stored in the T on an Android phone. And Huawei has a fingerprint agent, which we'll get to in a minute and tell you how that works. And just for a background, an untrusted app in this context is an app you just install off your phone from the Play Store. I assume that it has no special permissions. You know, oftentimes you install an app, I'm sure you guys have seen it asking you for like access to logs or contacts. So none of that has been enabled. And if you know Android at all, you also know the untrusted app is the name of the SE Linux context, which an app is installed for. So it's a little bit in a sandbox. So we're going to be starting from that sandbox. So I had talked about the new security mitigations, but this is kind of what it looks like broken down into different trust boundaries. So on Android, you have your you have four components. You have your normal user land where all your apps live. This is exception level 0. And there's another talk I was in that actually went over the ARM exception levels. These are kind of like rings. And then you have exception level 1, which is your kernel, which on Android is kind of like a modified version of Linux. There's with a few lines added in networking and other things to enable certain Android security paradigms. But then there's sort of this shadow world that the T implements, which has its own user land and kernel land. And in its own user land, it has trusted apps, which have the secure storage, secure payment, has the biometric sensors like the fingerprint, implements things like DRM, things that we don't want our kernel to have access to. So hypothetically, the kernel should never have any insight into the trusted apps. Even if you root your phone, everything in the blue box should be out of bounds for the kernel. Of course, it can communicate with this world, but otherwise it would be useless, but it doesn't have direct access to the apps running it like it does for apps like Chrome or the Play Store. And then finally, to support all these applications in the secure EL0 or the trusted apps, we need another kernel which can do things like load apps, map in memory, and support things like IPC. So here's how the exploit's going to work in general. Here's the roadmap. We're going to start executing code in userland. So that's the assumption is they already have code execution on the phone. That's kind of a big assumption, I know, but just for academic purposes, just please accept it. People have found bugs in things like Google Chrome and Google Hangouts. So it's you can't imagine that if you want to take it a step further, you just begin executing code in Chrome or Hangouts or a bug through one of those. And then you can begin at the stage of this talk. So from userland, we're going to find a bug in the kernel, in Huawei's kernel, and we're going to exploit that. That will be a traditional root. That's just 2 bugs that I use, an exploit to get root on the phone. And then once we get root on the phone, we're going to take advantage of the privileges that gets us to find a bug in a trusted app. And then we're going to get code execution in one of the trusted applications. From one of the trusted applications, we're going to then go one step further and finally get code execution in the actual kernel, the TOS. And with the TOS code execution, we're going to be able to find this fingerprint sensor app. So it's another application that I actually didn't have access to, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We're going to find this application and patch it to accept any fingerprint. So a little bit more about Huawei. The T implementation is actually entirely depends on your chipset manufacturer. So Qualcomm has their own T, and Huawei also has their own T. Now, Huawei phones vary on which chipset they actually use, and this has something to do with, I think certain like baseband or cell phone stuff that I don't really know that much about, but some phone manufacturers will sometimes have their own chipset that they develop, and sometimes they'll swap them around. So there are a number of Huawei phones with Qualcomm, but Huawei also has their own chipset manufacturer called HiSilicon, which I think they acquired in 2010. This is a Chinese chip manufacturer that they now own, and they now make the Kirin chip series, which a lot of Huawei phones now use, but still not all. So the bugs that I'm about to discuss all affect the Kirin chip series, and they've actually all been disclosed as well, just as a disclaimer, and they do not affect all Android phones by any means, just Huawei phones. So the Huawei trust system architecture kind of looks like this. Now, the reason I'm going over this is there's a fundamental question we need to answer is how does a normal app actually start communicating with the trust zone and get anything meaningful out of it? Now, the first thing that we need to know is how does the normal world begin talking to it? How does the kernel talk to the trust zone? And there's a special privilege instruction known as SMC. I believe it stands for Secure Monitor Call, that only the kernel can issue to actually make a request and interrupt the trust zone kernel. So to handle this, Huawei and a number of other chipset manufacturers that have their own T have a kernel driver which takes requests from userland and will issue this SMC instruction on their behalf. Now, it gets kind of complicated because the kernel driver often wants to have some form of session management between itself and the trustlets that it talks to. So Huawei, in an attempt to be secure, actually has a number of these trustlets on the right implement their own form of credential checking. So secure storage can only be spoken to by my file management application. Other applications should not be allowed to make requests to it. My TA fingerprint trustlet should only be spoken to by fingerprint D, the fingerprint daemon. So the kernel driver is going to be passing credentials up to all these different trustlets, and then those trustlets in turn are going to be checking those credentials to make sure they're correct. But until we compromise the kernel, we're not going to be able to forge any of those credentials. So once we have kernel code execution and control the kernel driver, all of those trustlets, or many of them, are going to be off limits. Now, for an app to log in, what it has to do is talk to a user LAN program known as TCD, the T connection daemon. I believe that's what it stands for. I don't actually know. So it will actually open up a Unix domain socket to this daemon, and once it opens up that socket, the daemon is going to read off the credentials from the socket. This is something you can do in Unix. You can get, I think, the UID in the PID of your connector or your client, and then it will use that to look up actually which application itself is making the request, and then it will make ioctls to the kernel driver file descriptor that it has open. This is kind of complicated, I'm sorry. And it will do the login ioctls. Once it has logged in, and there's no way to log out, once it has logged in, the TCD will take that logged in file descriptor and send it back to the Android app through a C message, which is another thing you can do, interestingly, in Unix, or POSIX-based systems. Linux in particular, you can send file descriptors over Unix domain socket via something known as C message. So now our Android app has this file descriptor to the trust zone driver, and it can make ioctls like you normally would to a driver to make requests, and it can send parameters up and so forth. And one more simple step, and I've already kind of talked about this, the trustlets, of course, can talk to the kernel, what Huawei calls a trusted core, and it does that through normal system calls like a normal user LAN app is. So this is sort of the entire map of how things are communicating back and forth in a Huawei's system. Now, we're going to jump right into the bugs. And these are all very memory corruption focused. I'm going to assume a little bit of knowledge based off like security mitigations for memory corruption types of bugs, like things like ASLR, buffer overflows, and out-of-bounds bugs, and what you can do with those. I will try to go over them the best as I can, though. So the first thing we do, sticking in the trust zone domain, is we're going to target the actual kernel driver itself. Now, there are two vulnerabilities in the kernel driver which will allow us to actually get code execution in the kernel. So I've kind of already went over the responsibilities of the trust zone driver, but something I need to mention quickly is that and this is going to relate directly to the vulnerabilities, is that the sanitization of parameters is handled entirely by the kernel driver too, and this is where the bugs come up. So our driver needs to be able to handle sanitizing complicated data structures like memory buffers as well as integer values. Integer value doesn't sound complicated, but the buffers are. And once it sanitizes those and serializes them, it's going to be sending those up to trustlets that it chooses, and the trustlets will then act on those, and that's how the communication will occur. So a little bit about how the normal world and the trusted core agree on things like memory buffers. So the normal world is often going to want to send up memory to the to destination trustlets. Now, there's a fundamental problem here in that the trusted core and the normal world kernel don't have a lot in common by nature of this design. So your normal world kernel has no insight into the trusted apps that are running, and that's the way it's supposed to be for security reasons. So what happens is there's this small song and dance where the trusted core has a virtual address space, but it's actually one-to-one with the physical address space. So all of the virtual addresses that exist in the trusted core are actually the exact same. The values of those addresses are the exact same as the physical addresses values. So this becomes complicated because trustlets themselves don't actually follow this rule. They're mapped into their own virtual address space. And one of the reasons they do this is so trustlets can have more security via ASLR, which is address-based layout randomization. And it's a pretty standard way of making an attacker's life more difficult. So what has to happen is the normal kernel now has to look up physical addresses of any buffers that it wants to pass in to the trustlets, and it has to send those up to the trusted core. And then once it has a physical address, the trusted core can say, oh, I understand physical addresses as well. I will take this physical address, I'll map it into this destination trustlet, and now your destination trustlet can access it because I know about the trustlets page tables. I can modify them as I like. So this introduces our first problem where during the process of actually creating this physical address, we have a pretty severe out-of-bounds write. So, well, not an out-of-bounds write, but an out-of-bounds bug. So if I want to send up a memory reference or a buffer, I'm going to be sending up a virtual address up into the kernel. Now it needs to immediately translate this to a physical address, but for some reason Huawei also included the option to specify an offset into this memory reference, and they never check this offset. So what I can do is I can give it a kernel address, and I can give it an arbitrary offset of 32 bits, and now I can do an out of bounds and access and specify a different physical page which doesn't actually exist in my address space. And just for those who are curious, the kernel address I don't control. So as you see, it's iterating over this linked list. It's going to ensure that I, in my own userland process, register pages and say, these are userland pages which I'm going to pass up the trust zone. And when I pass up an address, it must exist in this list. And then it will use the correlating kernel address, which it is aware of, as one of the operands to that addition. So this allows us to specify an arbitrary physical page to pass up the trust zone. And now, once the kernel passes up that physical page, the trust zone doesn't know any better. It doesn't keep, while it theoretically could, it doesn't actually keep track of the normal world's page tables. So this will create an issue where trustlets will begin operating on memory, which actually exists to the kernel or belong to the kernel and not to the userland app, which is making the request, which is a pretty severe vulnerability. So as you can see, we can pass any physical address of any page mapped in. And we'll use this to write. Now, this becomes more complicated because I would also like a leak before I do the write in the kernel, so I know precisely what I want to write over. Now, here's a slightly more interesting bug, in my opinion. And this is sort of a design flaw. Huawei seems like they didn't actually know this subsystem very well. So drivers can implement a number of different system calls to, when they're being operated on as a file descriptor, and such as open and close, and they also can implement mmap. Now, Huawei implemented their own mmap, and in fact, this is how you register pages that get added to the linked list, as I showed you earlier. You say, I want to mmap this page that I'll eventually want to send it to the trust zone. And what they do is you call mmap, they call a kernel API called getFreePages. This is kind of self-explanatory. It gets a number of free physical pages. It binds those physical pages to the virtual address that the Linux subsystem created for it. And then it adds it to the linked list, as we saw. Now, the big problem is they had no idea how to actually clean up this operation. So how do you clean up? A lot of people don't know how to actually clean up a map page by a custom Linux kernel driver. So their solution was to implement an ioctl. As you can see, here's some of the ioctls they implemented. If you're not familiar with ioctl, it's a system call where you can send custom commands to a driver. So you give it an integer value, and then the driver will say, I know how to handle this command ID X, and then it'll have special logic for handling it. So now they have a case called shared mem release. Now there is a way to actually do this safely, but the problem with implementing it as an ioctl is that you're not actually talking to the rest of the Linux subsystem, which is responsible for managing this virtual page. So what it does is the TCNS shared memory release will actually free those physical pages. But because it actually never bothers to talk to the rest of the Linux virtual memory subsystem, it never actually cleans up the page table. So what you have in your userland process is a virtual memory mapping which now exists or now correlates to and points to a free physical page. So what happens when I free a physical page in the kernel is it gets added to a list of free pages, and this is very basic explanation of it. It gets added to a free list of pages in the kernel, and then when another application or the kernel itself wants to allocate more memory, the kernel will say, I have this list of free pages, you can just take this one. So what we can do is we can allocate memory in our userland process. We can, via the mmap, then we can issue the ioctl to free it. We still have that virtual memory page lying around, and then we can create a bunch of requests and ask the kernel to allocate more memory for us. For example, by opening files. The kernel will have to open so many files that eventually will need a physical page of its own, and at that point, it's going to take the physical page, which is still bound to our virtual memory map inside our userland process, and the kernel will begin essentially allocating kernel data structures inside our userland process, which is another giant issue. And you could use this for a lot more malevolent purposes. I just used it for leaking, but this is a pretty interesting bug. I think it's the first physical page use after free I've ever seen. So that can cause some havoc, and it's pretty fun. So as I say, with some kernel spraying, we can get the kernel data structures and get a leak. And in particular, I'm going to show you how I exploited this. So there's lots of ways to do this with an arbitrary write. This is just the way I chose. So I wanted to overwrite a file operations pointer table. So a little bit about files, how files are implemented in Linux and Unix systems in general. I'm sure many people are familiar with the file descriptor. It's sort of an opaque number which represents a more complicated structure in the kernel. So when I open a file, I have the file descriptor, and that correlates to this giant structure that the kernel has in its own memory space, which has this file operations pointer table, which is you can think of kind of like a C++ V table. It's a way to kind of do object-oriented like things by essentially allowing you to overload a lot of different operations. So the way a file descriptor in Linux can do so many different things, as we know, file descriptors can be a socket or it can be a file of many different kinds of formats, it uses this file operations table to implement all sorts of different methods. It also contains things you'd expect the file to maintain, or the kernel to maintain, like an offset and the permissions the file was opened with. So, for example, if we open a file on a normal Linux system, we're going to have our operations pointer table like ext4, read, ioctl, and lseek. But what we want to do is overwrite that file operations pointer table and point it at a ROP gadget pointer table, which will do nasty things for us. So for those unfamiliar, ROP stands for Return Oriented Programming. It's a way of bypassing NX, which is non-executable memory. So just because we can't introduce executable code into the kernel, we can reuse the code that is just in the kernel to do things we would like. Like, for example, I have two examples of ROP gadgets here. I have a write gadget, which will take whatever in X1 and write it to X2. These are ARM64 registers. And then return, and I have a leak gadget, which will load the value that X1 represents as an address and populate X0 with it, and then return. And X0 is the return value in ARM. So if you have X0 returned, that's the value that lseek, for example, will be returning. So what I can do once I set up this fake table is I can say lseek to this address, and then the return value of lseek will actually be the value of that address and not what has actually been lseeked. So to redirect the alpha-ops table, we're missing one piece. We have this arbitrary write, but we need a component in the trust zone which will actually do the write. So here I actually have a screen cap of IDA. So as I said, the T is completely proprietary. The chipset manufacturers have no obligation to open source any of this. So if you want to start looking for bugs in your trust zone, you have to begin reversing it. I was lucky enough to afford a decompiler, which not everyone has the privilege to do. But this is what it looks like. It's very nice. So the first thing that I found that did this is an interesting global command that anyone can actually talk to or request from the trust zone, which is command ID need load app. Now this is kind of a weird function which will tell you if you need to load an app or not into the trust zone. So I will give it a UUID, which Huawei uses as a way to recognize individual trustlets. So each trustlet has its own UUID, and their trust zone kernel will tell me, is this UUID loaded? If it's not, it will say, yes, you need to load this app. I'm going to write a 1 back into your buffer. If you don't need to load the app, then I'm going to write a 0 back into your buffer. So what I can do is I can point this buffer, as I control, I can point that at any physical page I like. I'm going to point that at my fops table that I want to overwrite, and I'm going to begin writing a 1 or a 0 there. So I have essentially an arbitrary write 1 or write 0. It actually becomes a write 1 because these are UUIDs of values I don't know about, and I can't control the value of what I want to write to. So I have an arbitrary write 1. Now, how do you, with the ability to write a 32-bit 1 anywhere in kernel memory, how do you exploit the skate code execution? So I was fairly fortunate and I could trigger this as many times as I like. So what I did is I took this file operations pointer table. As you can see at the top, we have this kernel pointer, which is pointing to an existing ext4 file operations table, and I overwrite it piece by piece with little endian 1s to shrink it into an address that points into userland. So I can overwrite the very first 4 bytes and make that into a 1. Now the address is much smaller. Then I can overwrite the next 3 bytes, and I can make that into a 1, overwriting the original 1 that I placed. And then I can sort of even it out. This third transition actually isn't legal. I can't map that page. It's too low. There's an mmap min requirement, which stops nullity reference bugs from being exploited. So I need to write another one to bring that up to a more manageable address that I can actually map into my userland process. And at this point, we've actually now pointed an existing ext file operations pointer table into userland. So now whenever I want to make a or write or read from that file or lseek on it, it's going to be using my file operations table in userland memory to figure out where those functions are implemented, so I have code execution in the kernel now. So with those raw gadgets I showed you, I can now overwrite my CRED structure. If you're not familiar with Linux kernel exploitation, that's okay. I now have arbitrary read and write, so what I can do is just say my UID is now 0, essentially, and that makes me root. So now with root, we still have 2 more stages to go, so I hope you're not bored. So these are a little bit less painful. We need to now own a trustlet, and in this case, we're going to be owning something known as a secure storage trustlet. This is what's responsible for transparently encrypting files on disk. So not all phones actually offer this, but Huawei has a special safe feature that they offer where you can essentially say, I have these files, and you need to put them in a special place. And the way it's going to handle this is it's going to pass the content of those files to the secure storage file trustlet, and it's going to be encrypting them with a key that your kernel has no idea about. So theoretically, this means that even if your phone gets rooted by a malicious actor, all the files you put in your safe are absolutely safe because they have no way of finding that key. Now, unfortunately, the secure storage trustlet is actually riddled with bugs, so it doesn't really matter. Now, there's one big type confusion here. And to talk about that, I'm going to have to go a little bit back into the sanitization. So the way they actually handle the sanitization of these different parameter types isn't that complicated. They have a union, which means they essentially have a data type that can be one of 2 things. And they have a union which can handle either values or memory references. Now, a memory reference has the buffer inside, as you might expect, and the union just has 2 integers that you can pass up. I imagine it's 2 just because the buffer, or the memory reference has 2 values, but you can pass up an A and a B. Now, they need a way to actually distinguish between these kinds of parameter types because it is a union. There's no way to type check this. And so when they're actually passing up this payload to the trustlet, they say, I'm going to have 4 parameters, which can be either a value or a memref, but just so you can tell the difference between these 2, I'm going to have an integer which can support type checking for 4 different parameters. So every single byte of that unsigned int will represent the type of each of the 4 parameters. Now, unfortunately, they never actually check param types. So I can create a secure storage file, and the secure storage file is actually kind of like a POSIX API. I can say I want to open a file, and then it will hand me back an opaque file descriptor or file handle, which I can then say I want to read or write from. So I can open up a secure storage file. Keep in mind I have kernel code execution, so I can now log into this trustlet and begin interacting with its API. And then I can so I can tell it that when I want to read from it, I'm going to give you an integer as your buffer argument. And since it never actually checks those param types, an integer will now be used as the buffer, and this essentially prevents them from being able to type check and make sure that the buffer address is actually pointing to a valid region. So what this causes is essentially me to read or write to any place in the trustlet itself. Now, the way this, so to give you an analogy of this would be similar to if you had a Linux kernel or any kernel that never actually checked the user land pointers that you passed in. So when I say I want to read to this address, what it's going to do is going to say the buffer that you want to read into must exist in user land. It cannot exist in kernel land. And it's going to check that against a boundary between your user land and your kernel. Now that check never occurs. So what we can do is we can just read data back into the trustlet itself and overwrite its function pointers. Or we can write data out of the trustlet and leak values from within inside of it. So how do we actually exploit this? And this is a different kind of file format. It's not like your typical form of a process in memory. This all exists in a weird operating context. So just through reversing, I found this tmalloc, which is kind of self-explanatory. Now it uses a table of function pointers to implement different size classes of requests. So what I can do is, as long as I can overwrite one of these pointers with my read and my write, I can actually get PC, program counter control, when I cause a malloc request to be made. Now, there's one small problem, and like I said, I have no idea how this is actually mapped out. Through a lot of painful experimentation, I found out that there's this very weird address space layout of a trustlet. So if you remember the memory reference that I talked about earlier, they had this interesting thing where they would have to remap buffers that my userland process wanted to pass up into the trustlet. Now it turns out that these memory references that are remapped in the trustlet's address space are actually read-write executable. So this violates the property of NX. I essentially have all these buffers which I control, which have both writable and executable memory. So what this means is that I can point any of these tmalloc function pointers up into my memory references, and then my fourth parameter to my trustlet call can be my shellcode. And that makes exploitation very simple. So then as soon as I get that tmalloc call invoked and I do my reads and my writes, I can get code execution immediately and have that trustlet code execution and begin writing my final stage payload, which executes or exploits the kernel. Now there's one small problem. Starting with the P9, trustlet loading actually implemented ASLR, which is the address space layout randomization that I mentioned. So I don't know where the tmalloc address space is going to actually lie. But they only gave ASLR a single byte of entropy, which makes it very easy to brute force. So additionally, as soon as a trustlet crashes, these are meant to be very robust. They'll immediately be loaded back up, and they're actually put in the same exact address which they were originally loaded into. So at most, there's 256 guesses that I need to make to hit that trustlet. But even then, there's another problem in that root has access to all these log files, which just reveal the ASLR outright. So I can completely defeat the trustlet ASLR just with root because they log any crashes that are made to task storage. So if I find a single nullity reference in any of these apps, I can leak their ASLR, which is finding a nullity reference is pretty easy to do in these applications. So now we have trustlet code execution. I have used the leak to actually overwrite those function pointers in tmalloc. Now all I need to do is find a bug in the Huawei trusted core itself in the kernel. So a little bit about what the TrustZone kernel does, what responsibilities it has. Again, it provides IPC. So actually when I'm making a request through the kernel to talk to a trustlet, this is actually hitting the trusted core first, so it can remap those memory references, but then also it will dispatch the call to the destination trustlet. It supports the memory address translation process, which I just mentioned. And it also has all the trustlets in its address space. So once we have trusted core access, we can hopefully find our fingerprint trustlet and do things to it, like make it accept any fingerprint. Now, there's one big vulnerability here, which anyone with kernel exploitation experience or kernel security auditing will probably be familiar with, and that is there's absolutely no pointer sanitization. So every single system call that I pass up, they'll never check those pointer values to make sure that they exist within just the trustlet's address space. Now, this is partly, I think, because of this weird issue where they're actually mapping the trusted core into the middle of memory instead of at the very top like you see in a normal kernel. For example, a Linux kernel, you have all of your userland apps in the bottom of memory at lower addresses, and then you have your kernel at higher addresses, and it makes it very easy to check between legitimate pointers, legitimate userland pointers, and kernel pointers. But because they have this trusted core in a weird location, it's not as easy for them to make this check. And I don't know what rationale they chose for doing that, but it causes problems. So this means that to actually exploit the trusted core, I mostly just need to reverse engineer the kernel and find a strange sequence of system calls which will give me a magical write what where, which is the holy grail. It means I can write any value I want to any address I want in the kernel, and that alone should be enough to get me code execution. So a little bit about the trusted core environment. What kind of security mitigations we're dealing with. There is no ASLR, or I guess in this case it'd be KSLR, but there are, and this kind of contradicts what I just said about no pointer sanitization, there are some functions which strangely do have hard-coded balance checks. So memcopy inside the trusted core does check to see if it exists within those boundaries, but almost everything else does not. There is something called PXN, which stands for page execute never. This is an ARM mitigation, which says that I can't execute code in user space. So back in the olden days, I used to be able to put a shellcode payload in my userland process. I would write a function pointer over in the kernel, and I would just say execute my kernel exploit payload in userland, and it would oblige. But it will no longer do that. ARM has protections against that. There's also no PAN, so I can access user space just fine. So this stands for Page Access Never. If you're unfamiliar with these, you might be familiar with their x86 equivalents, which are SMAP and SMEP, which are like supervisor mode access protection and supervisor mode execution protection. These are essentially equivalents. So with the access never, what should occur is that if I ever want to access an address in userland, I have to go through a gate first. And the kernel will say, okay, I'm going to briefly turn off this mitigation, do whatever accesses you need on this userland structure, but then immediately return and make sure that any other accesses violate. So there's no gate we have to go through, which makes it quite a bit easier to do exploitation. Now, there's also no DEP, which stands for Data Execution Prevention. This is similar to write XOR X, which is you can't have writable and executable memory that exists at the same time. So this means that our kernel heap is executable, which makes it a great place to store shellcode. Now, interestingly, for a kernel with only about 9 different processes, it actually has about 300 different system calls. Now, I don't know why it needs so many system calls, but I suspect this has something to do with Huawei just completely ripping off another real-time operating system kernel that they found online that has all this functionality that they don't need. So some of these are also behind permission checks, which will stop us from having as large of an attack surface as we would like. Now, there are a number of primitives in here that exist for different system calls, and this is a little bit more of a pedantic slide. If you found the rest of the talk pedantic, this is going to be really bad. So there's no magical like write arg1 to arg0 system call, which is what we'd want. We would love to find a system call which just would take our first argument and write it to whatever address, whatever pointer is in our 0th argument, or vice versa. Now, we don't have that, but we do have other weird parameters. So we can allocate a 16-byte string we control, and we can write the pointer of that to that allocation anywhere in the kernel. That's pretty nice. We can allocate an arbitrary sized kernel heap buffer and return this address. This doesn't sound very juicy, but it's actually pretty weird. If you imagine a Linux kernel system call that would allocate a kernel heap buffer and then return that kernel address to userland, that's essentially the equivalent you would have. That'd be very strange. We can also write an uncontrolled dynamic value from a linked list into the kernel. I know that sounds odd, but this can be used to essentially, we can use this at will. So once we control that linked list, we can write values anywhere we want. Now we can also copy the trustless process name to an arbitrary address. This is not as nice as it sounds because we can't change the name of our trustlet processes. There's no nice system call to do that, or at least one that I could not find. And then we have another bug which will, via an overflow, this is nothing to do with pointer sanitization, we can get a leak. So we can now leak values from the kernel arbitrarily. Okay, so this is my most pedantic slide. I'm not going to really go over all of this. If you're curious, I suggest you talk to me about it before. But what we essentially do is allocate a kernel buffer to store shellcode in. We leak the address of our process name pointer. So we have a giant table of string pointers which have all of our processes' name in it. We find out where that exists. Once we have that, we're going to point this linked list to a small snippet of 16 bytes we control. So we control some of the linked list. We're going to point that to our stack, and then what we can essentially do is we're going to continue to unlink this list and get it to do arbitrary writes for us. And then once we're doing those unlinks from our stack, we're going to write kernel shellcode into that kernel buffer that we just allocated, and then we're going to overwrite a function pointer in the Huawei trusted core, which there are plenty of, and we're going to make that function pointer get executed, and as soon as that happens, we're going to be executing trusted shellcode. Now, I know that sounds really exciting, and that pretty much means we're done, but there's actually one interesting problem left, and that's I actually had no idea where the fingerprint logic actually was. So if you take your trusted execution environment OS image off the phone, you're going to get this blob with about 6 different elfs in it. Some of these are kind of self-explanatory, like your keymaster and your secure storage, but there's nothing in there which looks like a fingerprint module. For one, this should be pretty large. It should probably be larger than 100K. Fingerprint logic fingerprint checking is kind of complex logic, which will require some form of like image recognition or image matching. So where is it? So what I had to do was follow the userland fingerprint D around and see what kind of stuff it was mapping. Now the reason this is for Android to support so many different T implementations, the way an OEM like Huawei has to hook into this is they need to provide a library that gets loaded into fingerprint_d that has an API that it uses. So there was an interesting library called FPC TAC shared. I think it stands for fingerprint something, TAC, trusted agent, something. I don't know what the C is in either case. But it has this really interesting blob in it where it takes this hard-coded path with a UUID.sec, and then it calls teak open session on that. So this is going to cause us to have, well, this causes a lot of questions, right? What is this? If you run a file on it, it's certainly not an ELF, it just says data. So this is actually an encrypted trustlet. Now, why Huawei felt the need to encrypt this trustlet begs a lot of questions about where Huawei got this fingerprint checking logic. I don't know. I've heard from some people they think it might be stolen, which would seem pretty likely to me, but I don't know. It's just a rumor. Now, what do we do with this? So with the trusted core code exec, we can dump encrypted memory. So although it's encrypted, we can get around that because for fingerprint checking to work, the code must be decrypted somewhere in memory, right? So since we have the code execution actually working, what we can do is crawl the address space and find any ARM instructions. So we're just going to be blindly going through our entire address space as a trust-zone kernel looking for ARM instructions, and once we find some, we're going to be looking for string references for things like fingerprint and fingerprint_d and FPC, and this very naive approach actually worked in my case. I was able to find the fingerprint checking logic just via this. Once I found the fingerprint_d strings, I was able to crawl up and find the ELF header and then very gracefully just extract the entire ELF. Interestingly enough, when I pulled it out, decrypted, it had symbols in it, so it was very easy to reverse. I think there was actually a function called identify image, and that logic was essentially just returned to 0 or 1 based off whether that was the correct fingerprint. So I just whipped up about 3 different ARM instructions to null out that logic and write a 0 for correct. I don't know why this was inverse, but they said 0 was correct. And then return, and once that patch occurred, we were done. That actually finished it. Now, that's essentially the end of the slides, but I have a demo. Sorry, I have a demo. So where I unlock the phone with my nose. So here it goes. First of all, a little bit of if anybody actually wants to. I don't like the volunteer things. I'm not going to ask anyone to come up. But so as an example, I have the locked phone. I'm sorry if it's hard to see. I can use my index finger to unlock it. Okay, I cannot use this index finger to unlock it. I know this isn't very convincing, but it's working. So I can't use my nose either. It won't work. Now, just a second. Now I'm going to run the untrusted app. I have it installed here. All right, it's running. It's not 100% reliable. Okay. Just one more time. It just crashed, so I have to run it again. This is actually this is not a production piece of software. This is just a proof of concept. So one moment. Luckily, I still have about 8 minutes left in my talk, so there's plenty of time to see me unlock this with my fingerprint or my nose. Okay. Hopefully the second time is a charm. All right, it's running. Okay, I'm sure not everyone, oh, Jesus. 1 second. Okay, it worked this time. Okay, so it showed me the shellfish logo, which means it worked. Now, okay, lock screen. I'm gonna hold it up to my nose. All right. Thank you. Thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And of course, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them here or after the talk. And one small pitch. Like I said, I work for Raytheon CSI. So if you're interested in this kind of work, if you're interested in reverse engineering as a job, or writing exploits as a job, or looking for bugs as a job, come talk to me. I know it seems like a crazy thing, but people do pay you to do that. So if you're interested, please let me know. And yeah, you can work for us. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
So once you're in the trusted core, can you like do anything to the baseband firmware, and can you like change it if you use the chip?
You can. Excuse me. I have played around with it, and you can modify. Oh, what? Okay, all right. So the question was, once I'm in the trusted core, can I essentially play with the baseband firmware, the baseband memory, and do things like blow E-fuses? Now, I haven't played around with the E-fuses, but you can read and write from the baseband memory that's loaded since it exists at a physical address. I think that could differ depending on, it's something I actually don't know that much about, but I have played around with it on this Huawei phone, and I was actually able to read memory out of their, I think it's their Belong modem, and write to it as well. So it is something, it is an interesting research introspection technique that you could use, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you everyone. Not very. I think it only works in the Huawei P9, but the bugs themselves affect many of the different current phones.
If it were portable, this is my personal phone.
Oh, it's a Huawei.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So that might be interesting.
What Huawei?
This is the.
Okay, so I disclosed this to Huawei through the P9, so they should be fixed.
I'm also running a really old version.
Okay.
Gray areas.
Okay, this is the P10 Plus. I'm running like Android last year.
You probably have other issues then.
I was going to update it, but like, I'm also running a touch screen also.
Okay, yeah.
So if updating doesn't work,
Yeah, it's scary. Yeah, well, the trusted bugs themselves and the core driver bugs, I'm pretty certain actually are fixed. I think I've actually looked, at least at the kernel stuff, the kernel driver, those are all fixed.
okay. So one thing that I found really interesting is the trust running
Yeah, it is actually.
Oh, why?
I don't know, actually. Yeah, it's normal low kernel running 64 mode, and
So if you have an address above 48, do they have to do?
see, there's not that much memory on the phone, so it actually works because on my P9 at least, I don't know if there's more RAM on your phone. I don't know what the answer is to that. But on my P9, which is like a
Sounds like a mess.
yes, it's a mess. Yeah.
So this phone has 6 gigs of RAM, so somehow they need to do something.
Maybe they ported to 64 bit. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't looked into it, but all interesting questions. Yeah.
Do you know how the secure boot process works? That's like the baseband boot
No,
first?
I actually don't know anything like that. But as you saw in my listing, there's a secure boot trust link. So that would be a place to look.
Alright, well, very interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you for the attention.
How much time did it take from the beginning to the end of this?
I would say about a month or 2 months. It's kind of a hard question to answer. So someone actually found the initial. I want to make sure I talk, but actually, they found the initial memory corruption bug, or remember my lab did at UCSB, and then we had that for about a week. Remember, then came back to it later. We started doing the trust research, and then at one point decided I want to make a full chain, and that chain process is where other bugs go.
So your employer is kind of affected with you don't know anytime or something.
Yeah.
You don't know in the beginning when they will succeed, right?
Yeah. So this was actually done independently of my employer when I was a student at UCSB, which is in California, so
Right.
so also the location of the Shellfish Lab. I don't know if you're familiar with Shellfish Lab, but that's.
I'll do that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Cool.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for attending.
So another question I just remembered. When you were doing the physical page use after free, so why did you have to use that other write exploit? Is the lead page not writable, or?
It is. It's just not.
So you only needed that.
You theoretically only need that one. Good catch. Most people don't catch it. That's actually amazing.
Well, it's me too, because I was like, no, kill me.
I think there is a technical graphical error that I maybe use once and try to fix it, but it does. Whenever I see the bugs, I don't try to fix it. Yeah, huge improvement. It depends what you're interested in. I think so CTF can encapsulate a lot of different sort of smaller subsystems. I don't know how familiar you are, but for example, yeah. So what I was in camouflage are a great way to get started. Now the issue with capital flying is that they can be a very steep learning curve. There's capital flags that are for people who play every single week individual and this can be very intimidating. And then there are other capital flags which are meant for trace out. The problem is it's hard to know specifically something on these but I would definitely look into that. Maybe CTS are run by colleagues and not CTS are run by random academics. Colleges, there's some really great CTS that run all the time. One by seeing measurement. That's a great one. That's actually meant I suppose it gets really good. So I personally really enjoy doing it. So as someone who's in the field, so I would say that that's definitely it's always running. Begin with very gentle questions. Begin with like, what is a byte? Is it Indianness? What is a buffer overflow? Eventually, can you split the buffer overflow, or can you find the web? And then the other thing that we would like to add is besides PDCT results running, there are also board games have hacking challenges similar to what I Yeah. That's good. So I focus on binary challenges, which means I do a lot of Python, I write a lot of Python. That works, yeah. Python will work. I use something called Loom tools, PWTOOLS, Python module, which has a lot of CTF and functionality perhaps they fit in. And then the other thing I have is a little bit for binary challenges, a little bit of a very intro is there's IDA. Now that's a very expensive tool that people use. It costs like $5,000. There's a free version. And there's other alternatives coming minor. It's $100. I just kind of a big price to pay, but that has a lot of so if you're interested in reversing the I did tools and Python and any sort of be familiar with well, I mean, you can still use it. Python isn't really. You can still use it. I actually don't make sure you use Python itself, but you should also I'm based out of DC. We have a number of musicians that are all on the East Coast mostly. So DC, the giant office in Melbourne, Florida, not Australia. And then we have other offices like in Huntsville, I think we have an office. And then we have an office in other, oh, Texas, sorry, lots of Texas. Yeah, that would actually be, that'd be great. Yeah. Yeah, that would be great. Actually, if you should let me try and do I would love it. Yeah. Like I said, we're always hiring, so if you have many places where you can tell that these are jobs right now in DC or any other locations. Are you based in DC?
No, I'm in the Southwest, but because I was thinking at least do something.
Yeah,
But that's
big company. A lot of
exactly. That's
yeah.
so. I'm based out of the Southwest, but people that track all these countries.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, if people are willing to relocate. I'm not originally from DC, so I guess, yeah. DC is one of those. Florida, I'm not a fan of, but yeah, everyone has opinions. Oh, I'm actually speaking to you.
Oh, are you okay?
Yeah, so,
I can figure out
yeah, I hope to see you there. Yeah, I love it. It's right. Yeah. Well, just to meet you. Hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
put your name right here, and then sign that.
Okay, got it.
David, when you hit your 10-minute mark, he's going to put up something that tells you 10 minutes, and then another one that's 5 minutes.
All right, thanks very much.
So there you go.
Appreciate it. Dude, thank you so much.
Go talk to Jenny, insurance.
She actually just dropped it off. Yeah. So we are good to go. Okay, awesome. All right, can everyone see the screen? You guys in the back. Yep. All right, before we get started, we're going to take 30 seconds to do a really, really cheap parlor trick to get more people to get in here. So this is the part where, so this talk might be like a 4 out of 10, but this is the part where like I've just dropped some crazy CVE that just like broke, I don't know, quantum computing or something like that. All right, so just make as much noise as you possibly can, just to like social engineer people into thinking there's something really awesome going on here. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, we're good. I just watched a couple more people trickle in. We should do this at the social engineering CTF, shouldn't we? We'd all get like, I don't know, like a snack badge or something like that. All right, so just like adjust this thing. If I'm back here, can you guys hear me? Or do I have to kind of lean in like this? Does this thing like expand telescopically? If I just kind of get a stool and just, okay, never mind. All right, so my name's Gabe Ryan. I work for a company called Digital Silence. I'm a co-founder and senior security assessment manager there. I'm going to skip like the really long like bio description just to save time. Basically, we're a pen test firm that is like 10 dudes, and we actually give a shit about pen testing, which is a novelty. But anyways, so I used to work for a firm called Gotham Digital Silence. I was based in their New York office. Did a lot of their red teaming and wireless stuff. My LinkedIn handle is kind of interesting. It's ms08067. I love it when people get the reference. Yeah. So this is a talk about 802.1x, which, previous versions of it have kind of been beaten into a dead horse, but going to drop some interesting stuff here. But let's talk about what 802.1x is first and kind of just go over the basics. So 802.1x is an authentication protocol. It's used to protect local area networks and even wireless local area networks with rudimentary authentication. It defines an exchange between three parties: the supplicant, the authenticator, the authentication server. The supplicant's the client device that you're trying to connect to the network. The authenticator's, it's basically your switch. It's what the supplicant's connecting to get access to the network. And the authentication server is this host that's kind of chilling on the, in the background, and it's actually making the final decisions as to what gets to connect to this network and what does not. And it's usually running Radius or some similar AAA protocol to do that. So you can think of the authenticator once again as a gatekeeper. The supplicant's going to connect to it and provide it with a set of credentials. The authenticator is not going to know what to do with these, so it's just going to forward these on to the authentication server, which is going to validate the credentials and either allow or deny the device to access the network. Typically, 802.1x is a four-step sequence, as in like 99% of cases. It involves initialization, initiation, EAP negotiation, and authentication. We'll go over those in a second. Ports, so if you have a switch port that's protected by 802.1x, it's going to be in one of two states. It's either going to be authorized, in which you have traffic is completely unrestricted, or unauthorized, in which it's restricted to nothing but 802.1x related traffic. So we mentioned that the first step of the 802.1x process is initialization. Initialization, the supplicant's going to connect to the switch port, which is going to start out disabled. The authenticator is going to detect this new connection and enable the switch port in its unauthorized state. So you start with the port unauthorized. Then we move on to initiation. So this is where we initiate the authentication process. The optional first step is the supplicant's going to send an ePOL start frame to the authenticator. The authenticator is going to respond with an EAP request identity frame, and the supplicant's going to see that and respond with its username, because basically what's happening there is the authenticator is saying, "Who are you?" Once again, the authenticator is really not going to know what to do with this, so it encapsulates it into a format that the authentication server can understand and forwards it off the authentication server. At this point, things get interesting. We mentioned that, so 802.1x is actually an encapsulation of Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, for use within this context. EAP, as you may know, can be implemented any number of ways, and long story short, they have, basically the supplicant and the authentication server have to agree on a method to do this. So they're going to haggle for a bit until they decide an EAP method they're both comfortable with, and then we'll move on to step 4, which is authentication. Specific details about how authentication should work, once again, are dependent on the method that we choose, but it'll always result of one of two things: EAP success or EAP failure. EAP success, of course, the authentication has succeeded, the port becomes open or authorized, and the supplicant can now send traffic through it. Otherwise, the port's going to remain unauthorized. So we've been talking about EAP a lot. So what is it? We mentioned it's short for Extensible Authentication Protocol. It's an authentication framework, really. It's not really a protocol because it's only defining message formats. You can think about it as a black box for performing authentication. Individual implementations of EAP are known as EAP methods, and that's kind of where the nitty-gritty technical details of how this authentication is going to take place are actually defined. Some notable EAP methods, which we'll go into more detail later. EAP MD5, spoiler alert, it sucks. EAP PEEP, it doesn't suck quite so bad, but it's been exploitable for 10 years, so. I know it's just soap, but it looks really delicious, so I decided to put this in there. EAP TLS, so this is interesting because EAP TLS historically has been thought of the least shitty of these options. Although there were some pretty awesome researchers from South Africa who released a way to bypass this in certain circumstances at DEF CON last summer, so you might want to go look at that. I think it was Dom White and handle is Cable Thief, I forget his full name, but go look at their work. Anyway, so all right, so now we've gone over EAP and 802.1x. Let's go over a brief history of wired port security. So 802.1x 2001 was the first version of the 802.1x standard, and this was released back in 2001. Who would have thought, right? And this was created to provide rudimentary authentication for local area networks. The protocol was expanded in 2004 to facilitate the use of 802.1x on wireless environments. And in 2005, which is just 1 year after that, we have the first working bypass of 802.1x 2004 in wired environments, actually. And basically, this researcher, Steve Riley, figured out you could just insert a hub between the supplicant and the authenticator, and that would allow you to passively snip traffic. I'll go over why that is later. So this is really cool because you can now it's a passive bypass. You can't really interact with the network unless you just want to inject UDP packets all day because, if you try TCP, you'll get a race condition. But it's a really good start. 2011, 6 years after that, Ab from Gremlin Security created a tool called Marvin, which actually was the first device to bypass 802.1x by introducing the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the switch rather than relying on a hub. And it did this using, basically by setting up a bridge in Linux, and full network interaction was achieved using packet injection. It was kind of like an unwieldy solution. Another researcher, and this is actually regarded as the classic 802.1x bypass, the one that most people just kind of go to when they need to do this. Alva Duckwall released a similar tool later that year at DEF CON. that basically, once again, use a transparent bridge to place the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the switch. But unlike, unlike the Gremlin implementation, essentially, he was using source natting, using IP tables to just make it look like all the traffic leaving the rogue device were coming from the supplicant. So it's a much simpler, much cleaner attack, and that's the one that most people use when they have to do this. 2017, a researcher named Valerian Legrand created a tool called Fenrir, and it works similar to Duckwall's tool, but implements the natting in Python using Scapy. So it works at a higher level. It's supposed to be easier to deploy, has a modular design, support for responder, etc. So whenever, in my opinion, whenever you start kind of like researching a new technology or even a way to bypass a new technology, a really good starting point is to learn the existing work really, really well, and to see if there are opportunities to improve upon it or build off of it. Do that too. So some of the first things that I did here was take a closer look at Duckwall's 802.1x bypass. We mentioned that it uses a transparent bridge to silently introduce the rogue device between the supplicant and the authenticator. And the network interactions achieved by using IP tables to create the source net. So one problem that Duckwall had to overcome is, if you're bypassing 802.1x, presumably you're doing this in an environment where you're not supposed to be. Like you're not going to just be like, presumably you're going to be like on like a red team or physical security assessment where you're dropping something off and you don't want to stick around very much tinkering with stuff. You want to get it, plant it and get out. But this means that you need some way to get back to this device in order to use it. So at the time, there weren't a lot of really great side channel options, like LTE, et cetera. It wasn't really available in the commodity market. So Duckwall's solution was to do two things. One option that he provided was to create a hidden SSH service using this, that basically you do this using destination natting. So essentially, it's an SSH service that only you can see, and you can connect to the device that way. That was more of a proof of concept. When you think about it, it's on the internal network and probably behind NAT anyways. So the other solution he provides is that you just send an outgoing SSH tunnel that essentially gives you a reverse shell, if you will, on the rogue device. So the other problem that he had to overcome, which is that the Linux kernel will not forward ePOL packets over a bridge by default. Existing tools deal with this problem by either patching the Linux kernel or, in the case of Fenrir, relying on high-level libraries such as Scapy. There are problems with both of these approaches, although at the time that these tools were created, this wasn't really something that could be overcome. So relying on kernel patches, you run into the problem where it's unwieldy, you have to patch your kernel, and you also not only have to patch your kernel, but someone has to actively maintain that kernel patch. Because if you think of the typical development path of the Linux kernel is going like one way, right? If you stop maintaining it and suddenly it starts going the other way, like your patch is going to stop working. And actually that happened. There are no publicly available tools or kernel patches that will do this at this current time. And then the alternative, and I think this is why, by the way, I think the reason why Fenrir was created was kind of to deal with this issue. The alternative is to use a higher level implementation using like a scripting language or something like that. The problem is that can make the bridge slow under very heavy loads. And what happens when you introduce a bottleneck to a network and you're trying not to get caught? Well, you get caught. So fortunately, the situation has dramatically improved since Duckwall's contribution. As of 2012, ePOL bridging can actually be enabled to program, well, not programmatically, but using the PROS file system. The PROS file system, if you're unaware, it's kind of like an API that the Linux kernel gives you to reconfigure things on the fly. So essentially, you just set a value in a file, and the Linux kernel uses that as a config value. So what this means is that if you do that instead, you don't have to rely on patching anymore, which is great. Also, we mentioned that we had to kind of rely on outgoing SSH tunnels for side channel interaction. Remember this was 2011 when Duckwall's bypass came out. Cellular modems were pretty unsophisticated. They were slow. They were expensive. So the solution was to rely on SSH. The problems with this approach, well, there are a couple of them actually. The first problem is that it relies on the assumption that egress filtering can be bypassed, which it's not always the case. Although with a lot of determination, it's usually possible. But and the other problem is that it relies on pushing traffic through the target network, which creates an opportunity for detection. So our updated implementation that I kind of threw in here, what I did was modify some of the firewall rules to get this to work, but I've actually made it so you can use a side channel interface to provide connectivity to the device. So whether you want to use some kind of radio or LTE dongle or whatever you want really, you can connect to it that way, not have to rely on that outbound connection. So here's just a quick demo of this bypass in action. just going to define some things really fast. So on the left-hand side here, we have our attacker. The attacker is going to SSH into our rogue device. And then on the top right here, we have, this is a screen capture of the supplicant device, the workstation that is connected to the switch. And the switch is this thing in the bottom right. This yellow Ethernet cable all the way to the right on the switch is the one that's connected to the supplicant up here. This green light right there indicates that the device is currently authenticated and connected. If you see this green light turn yellow, it means authentication is currently in progress. If you see it turn off and stay off, one of two things has happened. We've either disconnected the workstation from the switch, or we've been burned. You know, it's detected us and it's locked the port. So hopefully that doesn't happen. So right, we're gonna SSH into the device here. I'm just gonna speed through that a little bit. And the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna set up that passive bypass, and that will let us get basically, you know, passively collect the meta information that we need to set up the full interaction. So we're gonna create the bridge. It's just a simple command. You run it like this, and you see we're bringing the bridge up. And you'll notice here that, you know, this device, you know, the workstation is just constantly pinging 8.8.8.8. It's Google's external DNS server that everyone uses. And if you see here, you'll notice that the destination host has become unreachable. That's because we've disconnected the workstation from the switch by introducing the rogue device in between the two of them. And this light has turned off. So, you know, now we're going to, you know, we've run this, and you'll notice that the light turns back on. It's now green, and the workstation's able to keep pinging stuff, which what this means is that we were able to successfully perform the passive bypass. So now we're going to set up full interaction because we actually want to be able to, you know, to push traffic onto the network. It's going to take a couple seconds. You're not going to really notice much from the perspective of either the switch or the supplicant, but you will notice that the script will finish executing after kind of obnoxiously hanging for a while, which it's doing now. And when it does that, we will be able to run an mmap scan from the rogue device as if it was coming from the supplicant. And bam, yeah, we were able to run just a very simple ping scan, and it worked. So the reason why all these attacks work that we just described, you know, the hub-based one, the injection-based one, the bridges, all of it, they all take advantage of the same fundamental security issues that affect 802.1x 2004. Actually, security issues, should I say. And the first one of these is that the protocol does not provide encryption, right? It's not an encryption protocol. The other issue is that it does not perform authentication on a packet-by-packet basis, which kind of opens the door for all this nasty stuff. The solution to this that was introduced was another amendment to the 802.1x protocol called 802.1x 2010, which uses a technology called MACsec to provide layer 2 encryption that's performed on a hop-by-hop basis, and also provides packet-by-packet integrity checks. So this is pretty cool because the hop-by-hop encryption you know, allows you to protect against bridge-based attacks, but also allows you to keep inspecting that data as it's in transit. So it's good from the perspective of the network administrator. It's good from the perspective of trying to stop these attacks. The 802.1x 2010 protocol works in 3 stages. We have the authentication and master key distribution and the session key agreement. This is very similar to what we saw before. And then we also have the session secure stage. The stage 1 is authentication. Essentially, this is exactly what we were looking at before when we talked about the main 4 steps of 802.1x. The only difference is we're going to get a little more stuff passed between the authenticator and the supplicant, you know, at the very end of it. And also we have the next step, we have the session key agreement. And when this happens, the authenticator is going to determine whether or not the supplicant is actually capable of supporting MACsec. And, you know, if it is, you know, you have the key name and SAC is installed on the supplicant, and then you proceed to stage 3. In which stage 3 is actually when MACsec is actively being used to encrypt all data from point to point. So, you know, when thinking about how to get around this issue, right, you know, to get around the you know, kind of how would you bypass this? I think whenever you're doing something like that, it's useful to kind of look for parallels, you know, with similar technologies that have been bypassed in the past, because, you know, as everywhere else in InfoSec, history tends to repeat itself. This particular passage from the IEEE standard for 802.1x 2010, actually section 6.6, kind of stood out at me. It kind of implies that there's a similarity between similar technologies that are used to protect wireless networks and this new iteration of 802.1x that's being used to protect wired networks. And I think what they're alluding to is WPA. And in fact, there are parallels between MACsec and WPA in the way that it's used. Remember back in 2003, we had the release of WPA1, and that provided hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption from the access point to the base station. Base station is just the fancy way of saying, the device you're connecting to the wireless network, so your cell phone, your laptop, whatever. And authentication was either provided using EAP, as we were looking at just previously, or using a pre-shared key as a fallback or alternative. So that's WPA PSK. Especially once WPA2 was developed, injection-based attacks were really no longer possible due to the introduction of layer 2 encryption. So this kind of this kind of actually resulted in a major paradigm shift in the way that wireless attacks were developed and implemented and executed. In that instead of focusing on injection and intercepting traffic, wireless researchers and attackers began focusing on attacking the authentication mechanism. So attacks against PSK, you have the WPA handshake capture and resulting dictionary attack. You also have the more recent PMK ID attack. Then you have the rogue AP attacks that you'd use against EAP in cases where weak EAP methods are used. So if we fast forward a bit to 2010, we have the release of 802.1x 2010, which is appropriately named. So 802.1x 2010 is also providing hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption, this time using MACsec. And instead of doing access point to base station, it's being done from the device to the switch, or from switch to switch even. Authentication is being provided once again by EAP or PSK as a fallback or alternative. So I think you kind of see where we're going with this. So, I guess my hypothesis here is that, the most obvious approach to take is to perform a similar shift of focus, since you cannot, use the bridge and injection-based attacks that were previously, that you could previously use against 802.1x 2004. The first thing that comes to mind is to try attacking the authentication mechanism. So PSK, I guess that would be some kind of dictionary attack. I'm still working on that because I've been working on this, but so no idea if that'll work or not. But EAP, why not try attacking weak EAP methods, because they're pretty prevalent. That's the main takeaway of this talk that we're going to go over. So to kind of know what we're talking about in terms of attacks against weak EAP, let's talk, rewind a bit, talk about some more background information, talk about attacks against WPA2 using EAP. So this is a diagram of a particular EAP method called EAP PEEP, which is very, very prevalent in wireless environments. The first step of the EAP authentication mechanism is that...
Hey, hey, T2. Yep. Hey, hey.
Hey, hey. Hey, hey.
Hey, hey. T2. Hey, hey.
That's really loud.
Hey, hey. T.
Yeah, so actually the main takeaway of this talk is I'm here to do what's it called again? Ventriloquism? All right, so, hey, hey. I hope you could hear this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to lean into the mic a little more. This is my ADHD going nuts right now. So the first thing that's going to happen here is that the supplicant is going to send an authentication request to the authentication server. The authentication server is going to reply to that with an X509 certificate. Now the reason why the authentication server is sending this X509 certificate is to make it so that the supplicant is able to trust the authentication server. So essentially, before this, what this certificate is doing is it's essentially trying to prove to the supplicant that the identity of the authentication server can be trusted. So at that point, the supplicant has the decision to make. It can either accept the certificate as valid, in which case it's saying that it trusts the identity of the authentication server, it is who it says it is, or it can reject it. And if it rejects it, we discontinue this entire process. But if it accepts it, we create a secure tunnel between the supplicant and the authentication server. And the reason why we have this secure tunnel established is because what happens next is that we're going to proceed from where we were before, which is the outer authentication of part of this process, to what's called the inner authentication part of this process, in which you're actually going to enter in your username and password and whole 9 yards, and that's going to get put into a format that is supposed to be difficult to recover and then sent through the secure tunnel, right? And without the secure tunnel, you could just sniff that. So the problem with this process is that an attacker can, anyone know what a rogue access point attack is? Okay, better question. Anyone not know what a rogue access point attack is? Yeah, basically. I'm going to go over it just in case someone doesn't. But the problem with this is that the attacker can perform an attack where essentially what you do is if you have a bunch of devices that are connected to this access point here, you force them to connect to your access point instead, which gives you a man in the middle. And actually the simplest way to do that is just to create a network with perform what's called an evil twin, which you create a network the same name as the target network, right? Like a hotspot or something like that. And then make sure that you provide a better signal than the target access point, and that will just cause them to roam to your access point, and then you've got the man in the middle. And you can do that by either denying access to the target access point, providing better signal strength, or both. So remember that, with WPA, until this authentication process is finished, we're not benefiting from that encryption, because the encryption doesn't kick in until we authenticate with the network. What that means is that this is all happening over open Wi-Fi. And we just mentioned that open wireless networks are susceptible to this evil twin attack, right, where you can make these devices connect to you. So it follows that WPA2 EAP, when implemented in this fashion, is also susceptible to an evil twin attack, where instead of just getting them to connect to you, you get them to connect to you, and then you force them to authenticate with your own authentication server that you're running in the background. Present it with a bogus certificate. Hopefully they'll trust it. You'll probably find some bozo who will accept your certificate on any average organization. And they'll connect to you, and yeah, that'll be that. I mean, essentially they'll send you their hashed versions of their creds, and you can crack those actually very quickly. Because typically when you're looking at EAP PEEP, that inner authentication mechanism, which by the way is also extensible, you can swap it out for different types of inner authentication, but the most common one is MS-CHAPI2, which is very, very poor. It's vulnerable to a cryptographic weakness that was discovered also in 2012 by Moxie, Marlon Spike, and David Holton. This is a bad year for Radius, which essentially you can reduce it. I mean, it's essentially 3DES, or it's analogous to NTLM v1, and that you can reduce it to a single 56 bits of encryption, and you can then convert those 56 bits into a password equivalent NT hash within 24 hours, the 100% success rate if you use Moxie, Marlon Spike, and David Holton's magical cracking rig, which at the time, that's a pretty high benchmark, but they made their cracking rig publicly available too. So and now actually, I talked to David Holton recently, and he said that was like a $100,000 cracking rig back in 2012. You could now get the same hardware for $10,000-$20,000. So it's definitely within reach of your mom and pop shop mobsters, let alone your nation states. Or your commodity pen testing firm, as the case may be. So back to 802.1x 2010. The most important takeaway about 802.1x 2010 from an attacker's perspective is that it also still uses EAP to authenticate devices to the network. That EAP authentication has to happen before we benefit from any of the new stuff that 802.1x provides. And as we just demonstrated, or discussed, should I say, EAP is only as secure as the EAP method used. Let's talk about some EAP methods that are supported by 802.1x 2010. The standard allows for any EAP method so long as it supports mutual authentication, supports derivation of keys that are at least 128 bits in length. And mutual authentication, by the way, that does not necessarily mean mutual authentication using certificates. It can mean mutual authentication in the same way that MS-CHAPI2 does mutual authentication, which, look it up, it does at the very end. And you need to be able to generate an MSK of at least 64 octets. So there are plenty of commonly seen weak EAP methods that meet these requirements: EAP PEEP, EAP TTLS, etc. I think you see where this is going. So this is where we talk about defeating, how do we actually leverage these conclusions into an attack against, well, this slide says defeating MACsec using rogue gateway attacks. That's not entirely accurate. It's more like, this should actually say cowardly avoiding MACsec in order to defeat 802.1x 2010 using rogue gateway attacks in instances where weak EAP is used, but that's really long and you don't want to read that. So the goal is to perform this rogue gateway attack. We can't perform a rogue AP attack because we're not on a wireless network, but if we could somehow force the supplicant to authenticate with our device somehow and crack the hashes, and we could then use those cracked hashes to authenticate with the network. So let's think about how we could do this. Your traditional 802.1x 2004 bypass, or 802.1x 2004 bypass is going to use a man-in-the-middle style approach, in which you're going to have the rogue device, which you can kind of see here. Can you guys see my mouse? Okay, I can see my mouse, so cool. You're going to have the rogue device directly between the authenticator and the supplicant, and essentially you're going to use that to middle the connection. In this case, we can't really do that. At least no one's figured out how to do it yet. I don't like saying never, but it would appear that you can't do that. So, the approach we're going to have to take is direct access, where we just find a way to connect the rogue device directly to the switch without being detected, I might add. So let's build a rogue device that can do this. How would we actually build such a device? Well, I mean, let's just think about your typical, device that you'd use, your core device that you'd use to perform a traditional 802.1x bypass. In our case, because we're using a side channel for connectivity, we have the just like an Intel NUC or similar that's running Fedora 28. The reason I used Fedora 28 was that it has support for MACsec. And we have our transparent bridge. That becomes useful later, although not for this particular attack. We also have an upstream interface, and that's the interface that's connected to the switch. And we have the PHY interface, and that's the interface that is connected to the workstation. We need a way of diverting traffic to the rogue device. So let's think about how we can do that. Here's a train station, or rather should I say railroad tracks with a switch that leads to a train station. If you notice, there's this mechanical switch here where if it's in the A position, the train is just going to keep going into the station, but if it's in the B position, it will bypass the station entirely and just go around it. We can actually do something very similar with Ethernet using these. You can buy these for like $5 on Amazon. They're great. So these are mechanical AB Ethernet splitters. Here's the front. You can see there's two switches on here. When you hit switch A, traffic goes from this little back port and is then connected to port A on the front of it. If you hit B, it's connected to port B on the front of it. So you can just kind of like reroute internet traffic in the same way that you could do with this train. We do need a way of manipulating the push switch, unless you want to hide somebody in the target, like data center or whatever. Just have them doing this all day, which it's obviously not going to work. So you need a way of manipulating the push switch. I actually tried using relays instead of push switches at first, to be honest with you, but like I'm not an electrical engineer, and you can buy relays that don't have impedance issues when doing this kind of thing, but they cost like $1,000. So I'd rather just make this something that is easily reproducible, and also you could, build using stuff that's available on the commodity market. So the other option is to use something called a solenoid. And a solenoid, there are two types. There are pull solenoids, there are push solenoids. But essentially, you have a metal rod that's surrounded by like a little wire that's used as a coil. You run current through the coil, and with a case of pull solenoid, it either just yanks the rod toward the inside of the coil. If it's a push solenoid, which is what we want, we push the rod outward, creating a push in motion. So it's a linear motor, essentially, I think. I'm not an electrical engineer, so if it's not a linear motor, whatever. So your full bypass, if we want to integrate this with our existing core device, you see here with this diagram, we have these little triangles on the left and right. Those are our AB splitters. They're being manipulated by the solenoids, which are controlled by an Arduino, which is then hooked up as a slave to the Intel NUC. It sounds complicated, but it's actually not. It's just a lot of, actually it's not really that many moving parts. And then also when the switches are in position A, we have a bypass. The traffic just bypasses the rogue device entirely. And then we have a passive tap, like a throwing star lamb tap or something like that, or a similar implementation that just lets us passively sniff traffic without really putting any traffic onto the network. And that lets us collect like MAC addresses, IP addresses, stuff like that. When they're in position B, traffic is redirected to our device, which is what we want. The switch here on the left goes to our upstream, and then the switch on the right goes to our PHY interface. So to perform this attack, this is the full setup here. We've inserted our device between the authenticator, which is on the left here, which is providing access to the internal network, and this workstation. We've brought down our upstream interface and our transparent bridge. We bring down the transparent bridge like basically permanently throughout this attack, because we're not using it. But we just bring the upstream interface down for now. But we leave our PHY interface up, and then we also start a rogue authentication server implemented using host APD to listen on the PHY interface. So what happens here is that this will cause a supplicant to, well actually you need to trigger this, but we'll talk about how to do that in the next portion of this. But if you trigger the supplicant to re-authenticate, it will authenticate with your rogue authentication server, which will allow you to capture credentials, and then at that point you can crack the credentials and then just connect directly to the network by bringing down the PHY interface and bringing the upstream interface up with the supplicant's MAC address and the supplicant's IP address, just set a static IP so you get to keep its IP, and then submit the valid EAP credentials. And if you do this during off hours, this is probably not going to be, as long as you're not causing a denial of service for this person over here, you're fine. This probably won't, you could probably get away with this in most cases. So here's our demo of actually doing this. Similar setup to before. We have the supplicant here. This time actually we have this really goofy looking blown up larger than life prototype device here. You don't need to have solenoids that are this big. These things here are really big solenoids, but like when you create Frankenstein, you use like really big parts so that it's easier to work with. It's kind of the same deal with this, but you can make this smaller easily. And then here's our switch as before. Same rules apply. That's our port. Green means the same thing. Yellow means the same thing. No light means the same thing. And here's our attacker over here. So we're going to run this attack. This time we're actually going to manipulate these splitters here. You can kind of hear them. That's actually pretty loud, like if you're standing next to it. Like when I first got this to work, my wife came running in because she'd been convinced that I finally electrocuted myself with this thing. Fortunately, I didn't. But yeah, as you can see, we were able to just reroute the traffic to us and capture credentials. It was kind of that simple. So it's really kind of a cheap attack, but I mean it works. So who cares? So yeah, that's our 802.1x 2010 bypass in cases where weak EAP is used. We're going to take a quick detour before we wrap this up and talk about MAC filtering and MAC authentication bypass. I ended up looking at this stuff as well. While I was in the process of, it just ended up kind of going off in this direction briefly while looking at all this other stuff. So fun fact, not all devices support 802.1x. You don't say, right? But not all devices support 802.1x. Unfortunately, enterprise organizations with 802.1x protected networks usually still need a way to deploy these devices anyways. So you kind of have your hands tied, but you still need to connect these devices. The solution is usually to disable 802.1x on the port used by the device. And when you do this, you're creating what's known as a port security exception. 802.1x in this instance is usually replaced with some weaker form of access control, such as MAC filtering, but not always. But historically, these kinds of exceptions were essentially low-hanging fruit for attackers. They were very prevalent due to the widespread use or widespread lack, should I say, of 802.1x support by peripheral devices such as IP cameras and printers. And frankly, spoofing a MAC address is a lot easier than going through the motions of trying to get the other stuff to work. So it's one of the first things you'd try to find. The problem is that port security exceptions are slowly dying. And this is something that you're just starting to notice it now, especially if you do a lot of these. But I think as time goes on, it's going to really get worse from the attacker's perspective. And the reason for this is that support for 802.1x by peripheral device manufacturers has actually increased dramatically. Legacy hardware is being phased out. It breaks. It reaches the end of its specified lifespan, whatever. And when it does, it's replaced by 802.1x capable models. And in fact, by the way, if you kind of want evidence of this, you can just kind of go online to like Newegg or whatever, and I'm sure you'll find at least, for every single manufacturer of, let's say, office scanners or something like that, you'll find at least one model that fits within an enterprise budget or even just a small business budget that supports 802.1x. It's kind of becoming more and more of a thing. I think we just said all this. But yeah, the result is that port security exceptions are becoming less and less prevalent, and they're not really quite the low-hanging fruit that they used to be. So the problem is, though, that improved adoption of 802.1x doesn't really imply support, or should I say, does not really imply strong port security for peripheral devices. 802.1x 2010 support, it's not really a reality yet for peripheral devices. Actually, you're just starting to see 802.1x 2010 taking off with the really expensive networking gear. Most of the biggest, I think the top few networking hardware vendors out there offer 802.1x 2010 support. But it's really expensive in most cases, and it's also something that, it's kind of flaky. It takes a lot to get it to work. 802.1x 2004, as we talked about earlier, it can be bypassed using bridges, injections, etc. It used to be kind of a pain, although the tool that I'm releasing at the end of this makes it a lot easier. And also you can expect, adoption for secure APM methods are pretty low across the board, and they're even lower for stuff that isn't, manageable in a centralized way. That if you're talking about peripheral devices, it's not usually domain joined, so it makes it a lot harder to just roll out a GPO or something like that that will enforce the use of a strong EAP method. So what about using EAP as a way of attacking these peripheral devices instead of relying on port security exceptions? Well, you could actually use the rogue gateway attack, a simplified form of it, to do this. So, we see a similar diagram to what we saw before. We have the rogue device here. This time we actually make use of our transparent bridge. We don't need to use the solenoids for this. We instead start out with our classic 802.1x 2004 bypass, but if we want to actually get credentials as well, we can just bring this, the upstream interface down, the transparent bridge down, and then start host APD on our PHY interface, and then at that point, capture our 802.1x credentials that way. Another thing to keep in mind though is that something that you don't really see as much on in the rest of the environment, EAP-MD5 is actually widely used to protect peripheral devices such as printers. The reason for this is that EAP-MD5, it's pretty insecure, but it's also very easy to set up and configure, and it's still better than MAC filtering, right? So, just a heads up, we're going to demonstrate how EAP-MD5 is actually like really, really bad. But, let's say that you're in a position where you've been told to roll out, EAP authentication. Cool. 10 minutes. I think we're good. We're rolling toward the end. Okay, so yeah, so essentially, let's say that you have to roll out 802.1x authentication across an entire network, and that includes peripheral devices. And you have like, I don't know, like 2 hours to do it or some stupid, getting flashbacks here thinking about it. But, you could technically roll out EAP-MD5. It would be pretty insecure, but it's still better than MAC filtering. And you can say, yep, I rolled out 802.1x, all this stuff, guys. Yep. Not lying. So here's how EAP-MD5 works. Similar to before, the supplicant's going to, well, actually, it's going to receive an EAP request identity frame from the authentication server. It's going to reply with its username, which is technically called the identity, but whatever. And the authentication server is then going to respond to that with an EAP challenge request. And this challenge request is going to be a randomly generated string that the supplicant is then going to have to throw through the MD5 hash. Well, actually, first it has to concatenate the challenge string with its username, its password. And once the username, the password, and the challenge string are all concatenated into one big string, that's thrown through the MD5 hash function. Out comes the challenge response, which is then sent to the authentication server. The authentication server then repeats that same process. It puts the user's identity, the password, and challenge string through the MD5 hash function, and then compares the output of that second, hashing, should I say, with the response that was sent from the supplicant. If they match, you have an authentication success. If they don't match, well, authentication fails. Going back to the work that was kind of released by Brad Antonowitz and Josh Wright in 2008, this entire process happens over plain text. And basically everything that you'd need to perform a brute force attack, the only secret here is the password. You can get everything else just by sniffing traffic. So essentially what you can do is you can capture the response, the identity, and the challenge string, and then just keep repeating that process that the authentication server does, keep trying different passwords until you can create a response using the MD5 hash function that is equivalent to the one that you captured from the supplicant. And it's kind of a slow attack because it's a dictionary attack. It's linear. If you ever study like runtime analysis or something like that, the rate at which it takes to do this is just going to increase linearly, which is not wonderful. But in 2012, there's also a couple of researchers named Fanbao Liu and Tao Zi. They released additional researchers that shows that you can actually reduce this time using a length recovery attack. So there's that. So leveraging all this information that we now know about how to attack EAP-MD5, and also what we talked about, how we could attack 802.1x 2004, it gives us a pretty good approach for essentially how you'd attack EAP-MD5 on a wired network. You could start out by using a bridge-based bypass to place the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the authenticator. You could then wait for the supplicant to authenticate and then sniff all the required information, such as the EAP-MD5 challenge, the EAP-MD5 response, and the identity when it does. And then you'd use this to crack the credentials, then connect to the network as we did before. The major drawback to this approach is that you have to wait for the supplicant to re-authenticate with the switch. And that actually will not happen unless the supplicant is unplugged. Disabling a virtual network interface isn't really enough. You can't just bring it down and bring it back up. That won't necessarily trigger re-authentication. You could use the mechanical splitters to force a disconnection. But if we're just attacking peripheral devices, that's a lot of overhead for not quite as much benefit. So the alternative is to use something that I kind of stumbled across while working on the rest of the stuff, and that's a forced reauthentication attack. So in this case, it's an EAP-MD5 forced reauthentication attack. Essentially, the first two steps, as we mentioned, of the EAP authentication process are that the supplicant is going to send the authenticator an epoll start frame. And that's saying, I want to start authenticating. The authenticator is then going to respond to that with an EAP request identity frame where it's saying, okay, who are you? Now, this first step of the process is optional. And the reason why this is optional is that the authenticator, the switch, needs a way of forcing devices to re-authenticate. So if it needs to get the device to start, to re-authenticate again, it just skips to step 2 and sends the EAP request identity frame. The problem with this is the supplicant has no way of verifying if an incoming EAP request identity frame has been sent in response to an epoll start frame or not. So this is a stateless transaction, right? So it doesn't actually, there's no way for it to remember whether or not it just sent an epoll start frame, and that's the reason why it's receiving this request identity frame. So what this means is that we can actually force reauthentication by sending an epoll start frame to the authenticator as if it came from the supplicant. You'd just use max spoofing and injection for this. The result is that the authenticator would send an EAP request identity frame to the actual supplicant. This would kickstart the authentication process, and both the authenticator and supplicant will believe that the other party has initiated the reauthentication attempt. And this is just kind of a quick demo of that happening. We're just using Scapy here to spam this thing and force it to reauthenticate over and over and over. It's kind of satisfying watching this, isn't it? In a weird way. Make a good GIF or something like that. We can revise our previous approach and kind of dub it the EAP-MD5 forced reauthentication attack by doing as follows. We'd first introduce the rogue device into the network directly between the authenticator and the supplicant. We'd start the transparent bridge to allow us to passively sniff traffic. We'd force reauthentication by sending a spoofed epoll start frame to the authenticator. Then we'd capture and crack the EAP-MD5 and EAP-MD5 challenge and EAP-MD5 response, as well as the identity. We'd use that to crack the password, preferably using the length recovery attack to speed things along a bit. And just to show you how quick this, how fast this is, we just run the command, and that's in that short space of time that we just saw, it reauthenticates, and we capture the challenge and response. So we've got everything we need. So proposed mitigation, I didn't really think about this too hard, but the first one that comes to mind is maybe introducing some kind of safety bit into the AP request identity frame, or having some way to verify that when the supplicant's receiving a request identity frame that it actually should be receiving that. But yeah, should probably wrap up a little bit. So just some closing thoughts. The main contributions of this that we're talking about today, we have the rogue gateway, which can be used to bypass 802.1x 2010 by attacking its authentication mechanism, very specifically weak forms of EAP. If you use strong forms of EAP, this won't work, at least in its current form. There's other options, though, that were released in the past couple of months or so, namely the EAP relay attack that Dom White and Cable Thief did. Also, we've introduced some updated and improved existing 802.1x 2004 bypass techniques, and we've packaged them in a format that it's really, really easy to use, because I personally hate being on pen tests or red teams and stuff like that, and having to monkey around with stuff while I'm on someone else's budget. So introduce that. Think about it like Metasploit for bypassing 802.1x. It's a good way to describe it. And finally, we've introduced the EAP forced authentication attack, which is a forced improved attack against EAP-MD5 on wired networks. The key takeaways here: port security is still a very positive thing. Please keep using it. It is not, however, a substitute for a layered approach to network security. Deploying 802.1x does not absolve you from patch management responsibilities, password management, et cetera. You still have to do all that stuff. And also, the benefits of 802.1x can be undermined due to continued use of EAP as an authentication mechanism, because EAP has kind of had it's a good concept, but it's kind of had a flaky history in terms of security for a very long time in the wireless environment, and it's the same authentication mechanism really. So it's kind of the improvements that we've added to 802.1x are kind of in some ways are undermined due to continued use of that. And finally, improved 802.1x support by peripheral device manufacturers is largely undermined due to lack of support for 802.1x 2010, and also low adoption support rates for strong EAP methods. If you want to read more about this, there's a blog post and white paper that you can get at digitalsilence.com/blog. I think it's the top result on there right now. There's also the tool that I'm talking about. That's at github.com/solstice/silentbridge. I know the least speak's annoying to type, but like some other dude took the non-least speak version, so I just kind of had to roll with it. But yeah, that's it. Any questions? Thanks. Sir in the front, red shirt.
So, and repeat the question. When a Windows, let's say a Windows machine reboots, it has the, what do you call it, the supplicant, and it re-authenticates in order to have a valid pipe. If
Yeah.
the user isn't logging in, what credentials do most Windows machines use in that situation to authenticate to the supplicant? Do you know?
So it depends. So essentially the first scenario is that it really depends on the AP method used. So if they're using APTLS, it's going to be a cert. That's already been configured to do that. If it's using credentials, the question is it the first time it's authenticating, or is it not the first time? Because so if it's rebooted, it's going to be a lot like a wireless network. It depends on how it's configured. The poor way to configure, if it's poorly configured, right, it's just blindly accepting untrusted certificates. That's not really something you see in Windows, because actually Windows has actually gotten a lot better about dealing with that. Android is an area where you'd see this, so that's not really as applicable here. It would just connect, like it would just submit the credentials. In the case of Windows, you'd probably see a prompt. So then the user is going to have to enter in, essentially whatever 802.1x password is going to have to go there, and they're going to enter it in. That stuff is going to be kind of sent, to the rogue device. Sir. Yep.
And all these attacks were against printers and IoT crap, right?
The second attacks were against printers and IoT crap. The first attack was against basically everything.
Yeah, but using TLS and certs.
Yeah, then you're fine. Yeah, which is.
So it's done right. You're basically telling the client, if you do a pen test, yeah, all this is good, but that doesn't really protect you because all I need to do is find a report.
Right. I mean, tentatively, oh, you're saying like if it's done right, all this will protect you, but you could still enter using the peripheral devices. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of like, and I mean, that's kind of like,
Same as it ever was.
yeah, essentially. I mean, it's kind of like one of those things where you have to look at, individual controls.
If the client has a good wireless network, but we have a pre-shared key network for barcode scanners, and well, that's the thing.
Provided they're not, properly segregated from one another, yes. But I mean, yeah, essentially, I mean, you're right. You have to look at the environment as an ecosystem, and if you start weakening one, you can have amazing security in this aspect, but this little thing that you think is, I've been told to stop, is inconsequential, will affect the other stuff. I guess, yeah, we can keep talking if you want to ask questions. I just have to get off the stage. But thanks, guys. Why am I clapping? I'm just, I'm tired. I look like Kim Jong-il up here. You know what I mean? Like, thanks. Thanks, appreciate it. Do you really? Yeah, that's kind of why
So then the smart money is tell your client they need to segregate the printers. Because that's not good.
Yeah, put that on its hand and voice over IP phones. That's something
Yeah.
you do. You do voice over IP phone, you have to do over IP LAN, and then you're on a different segment, and so you don't fuck with one segment.
Yeah. So then you say, tell me again why my phone is allowed to say a bunch of product. So you have access to the internet.
I'll say, but I was trying to get a prototype together. Sure. So, I mean, I just kind of didn't want to mess with it, so I turned it off. Right.
I don't see why I was curious. I don't really see. Oh.
I'm kind of leading the same direction. Thanks.
Oh yeah. Very safe.
What do you recommend to incorporate like cybersecurity, or just in general?
Yeah.
Like if you were going to a client, you want to workstation.
A TV station, or a TV network. and they want to do all this.
You could theoretically do something.
Sure.
Now you're starting to rotate.
How much do you want to spend?
You can get cheap money. Cisco money. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, just what I mean, it's not the first one. Yeah, this is that is one option too. There,
I also use that.
that's what it's going to take.
They have 2 weeks in it.
Yeah, I use those too.
Yeah, this is cool. I used to leverage it's pretty good.
Twitter's pretty good.
This is like it's easier to use success than I don't
want to knock America. Yeah, but I would say it's probably too easy. It does more stuff.
But it's similar, right? It's some way worse.
It's kind of the main thing is that it does a set of very specific things. It focuses really hard on the project. So it's not like we're staring at this massive menu. Here's all the things you can do. It's like, no, this thing is going to allow you to perform very specific bypasses. And it's pretty much all the development time you make sure it works every single time. And that's kind of the biggest advantage that comes in.
And you also optimize your file.
Yeah, exactly. So you can
Screen, and they give you a little dongle, and every one of those dongles has access.
That's why I want this event, I want this cable, I want this event, I want this event.
I've seen like really common people under a lot of pressure mess stuff like that up.
It's like I said, it's awesome.
I mean, maybe it's just like, yeah, let me hack your thing. Well, we're talking my favorite is to